Hello there, people. Once again, coming back to you with another Remnant video. Today, I'm going to be showcasing a melee build that I've been using on Apocalypse and I've been having a lot of fun. It is a very well-rounded build that can deal with pretty much any situation, not just melee. So let's get started, shall we? So I'm going to be using a medic and a challenger archetype for some various reasons, which I'll explain in just a second. Just a little disclaimer, although this build works on Apocalypse, there will be bosses that are flying, so you cannot really deal with them in melee range. But we're using a setup that allows us really good damage, range damage as well. So anyway, let's get into it. Medic, because, well, medic is the best archetype for using in Apocalypse. You have a shield ability, you have really good passives and all that. I'm not gonna get into that too much. But the challenger, now we're using challenger for the Juggernaut ability. What it does is when you activate this ability, you become unstoppable, which means you cannot be staggered. You gain 15% movement speed, melee speed, and reduced stamina cost. You also do 50% extra melee damage, and your stagger level is reduced by 1. So it's a really good ability, and it's only 48-second cooldown, which is amazing. Now, the reason why we use the challenger archetype is for all the passives. All of the passives are useful in every situation. So you've got close quarters, which means you gain 35% increased damage for enemies that are close within 10 meters. You've got intimidating presence. Every time you activate a challenger skill, enemies within 15 meters will deal 10% less damage, which is really good. The more enemies are there within close range, even this passive works even more. Then you've got the stamina cost reduction for each weight category, reduced by 50%. Amazing, because we're going to be using heavy armor. And finally, face of danger. Whenever you use a relic within 10 meters of an enemy, it grants you 2 stacks of bulwark, which is not a big deal because we're going to be having max stacks of bulwark at all times, and then 10% increased damage for 10 seconds. All in all, an amazing class for this kind of setup. Can't go wrong. All right, so let's get into the armor. I'm using Leader Mark II, which puts me to 90 weight category, which gives me the ability to dodge and not flop. For the relic, we're going to be using Crystal Heart. Now, in some cases, you might want to use the Shielded Heart, but again, it really depends on the situation. But for the most part, you're going to be using Crystal Heart, because when you activate this relic, it generates 115% health, but also gives you 25% reduced damage for 10 seconds. And when we are in melee range, this is insanely useful. All right, so for the Relic Fragments, we're going to be using melee crit chance, we're going to be using melee attack speed, and 15% increased melee damage. You could also, if you want, instead of melee damage or maybe melee attack speed, you could also use the melee crit damage, 20% extra melee crit damage. But since we're using a ring for that, we don't really need to. All right. Anyway, let's get on to our weapons. Our main weapon is the Wrathbringer. You get this by defeating the DLC boss, the final DLC boss, getting the normal kill. Now, why this weapon? Why did we choose this weapon? When you take damage, it gains a buff that increases its melee damage even further. Now, because we're using the Ring of Atonement, which self-inflicts bleeding on us, we're constantly damaging us every second. So you're going to have a permanent stack of the Awakening buff. As you can see here, 10 seconds. We're at 50% increased melee damage permanently, which is insane. So yeah, and another reason why we use this weapon is because this weapon has 80% stagger modifier. So while you're damaging regular enemies, even some elites, they're going to be staggered and they're not going to be able to deal any damage to you. Only bosses are immune to stagger effects, which is understandable, but other than that, stagger is amazing. You'll see.
Still bleeding.
All right, so for the mutator, now we're going to be using Vampire Blade plus 10. It increases melee damage by 25% while within 10 meters of a bleeding entity. Now, as I said before, we're always going to be bleeding because we're using the Atonement Fold Ring. Sorry, my webcam is blocking everything. I might just turn off. Hang on, give me a second. There you go. So, Ring of Atonement. We are Atonement Fold Ring. Sorry. It inflicts bleeding and it increases critical chance by 10%. So I'll get into that in just a sec. So while we're bleeding, we're constantly doing 25% extra damage. Also, melee hits versus bleeding targets will lifesteal 3% of the base damage dealt. We have ways to inflict bleeding on targets I'll get to that in just a second. So with this, we're going to be using the Nightweaver's Grudge, which increases our critical chance by 20% within 15 meters of an entity suffering from a status effect. Remember, entity counts as yourself, players, your companions, turrets, all that stuff, enemies, bosses, elites, whatever. Anything that can be affected by status counts. So since we're within 15 meters of ourselves, I guess, we are in a constant state of haste as well, which increases our movement speed, climbing speed, reload speed, melee attack speed, all that stuff. So we're in a permanent haste. As you can see here, we're in permanent haste, and we've got a permanent 20% critical chance. So 20% critical chance here, 10% critical chance here, and then we've got 10% melee critical chance here. So our critical chance is 35 plus 10, 45% melee critical chance, just like that. It's insane. Anyway, let's get on with the rest of our rings. We are going to be using Hardcore Metal Band. Taking damage adds 1 stack of Bulwark, which individually falls off after 10 seconds and max 5 stacks. We've got permanent 5 stacks of Bulwark because we are constantly taking damage thanks to the Atonement Fold Ring. So we're also in a constant state of 25% damage reduction. Amazing. On top of that, we're using the Alchemy Stone Ring, which increases base lifesteal by 6% while suffering from a negative status effect. Again, we're constantly bleeding, so we're constantly having a 6% life steal. So if you look at our traits, I'll cover that in a second. If you max out Siphoner, you're getting 3% life steal just like that, and then 6% from the Alchemy Stone. So constant 9% life steal just like that. To top things off, because we have a high base critical chance, we're going to be using the Probability Cord, which increases our critical damage by 30%.
Still bleeding.
Okay, I know you're still bleeding. Shut up. Right. So, yeah, amazing. Now, our weapon of choice. For the most part, even in Apocalypse, you'll just go running through enemies and just macking them without having to use any sort of abilities or power-ups or whatever. But in case of elites and stuff, you might want to use a little bit of help with the Song of Aether, which you saw me use. This, what it does is it fires an AoE debuff. It slows enemies. It also makes them do 10% less damage, which is amazing. Actually, 15%, not 10%. Now, if you're in a tough situation, if you're surrounded by too many enemies, just let out your weapon, activate the mod, and boom, Song of Aether. Enemies within 15 or like a large radius will do less damage to you, and they will be slowed down. Bosses are immune to the slow effect, but regular enemies and elites will be slowed down by a ton, and you can just smack them while they're slowed and staggered and all that kind of stuff. Now, we are using Twisting Wounds mutator on this weapon. You can hit the range weak spot or have a range critical hit on an enemy to apply bleeding. Because we have such a high crit chance, again, let me show you once again, our crit chance, our base crit chance is 35%. So you have a very good chance of applying bleed by hitting a weak spot or a critical. And once you apply bleed, you're going to be doing even more lifesteal. So our base lifesteal is 9%, but it goes up to 12% for bleeding targets. Amazing setup. And if that's not enough, if you want even more sources of bleed, you can use the Merciless Long Gun with it applies bleeding regardless, right? You just fire it and eventually it'll apply bleed. I'm using the Fetid Wounds, which also has it applies corroded on weak spot hits and range critical hits. Again, we've got a lot of good critical chance, so this will definitely apply corroded. And remember, corroded enemies do even more damage, take even more damage, excuse me. So all in all, we've got a nice setup. So these two weapons will take care of all your ranged needs. In case a boss cannot be meleeed, you've got plenty of things, plenty of tools to take care of ranged enemies. And all right, so let's get into our traits. We'll be using so we've got strong back and triage from medic and challenger, which is great. We're going to be using that. We use fortify and maxed out vigor. We got maxed out regrowth to counter the debuff effects of the alchemy stone ring. Remember, sorry, not alchemy stone, atonement field, excuse me. This applies bleeding constantly, so we need some regeneration to counter it. So we're going to be maxing out regrowth. You're going to max out spirit and expertise because you want your mod power to be back. You want to be using Song of Aether as much as possible. So we need our mod regeneration as high as possible. And then of course your skill cooldowns, you want to be using your challenger skill as much as possible. So we've maxed these two out. Bar skin for increased damage reduction. We've got arcane strike. This is an interesting one. Your melee hits will increase mod power generation by 50%. So while you whack enemies, so in many cases, when I've been surrounded by elites and a lot of mobs, I use Song of Aether and go to town, whack enemies, and I've already got my mod power back. So this is a really good skill. Try it. I personally use swiftness because when you're wearing a heavy armor, you're going to be running slow. So trust me, you're going to need this. And finally, siphoner to top off the lifesteal. All right. So let me cover a really cool, some sort of tips and tricks. What I did was to maximize to maximize the ease of use, I actually bound the melee hits to mouse wheel down because you're going to be hang on, let me put my webcam back now that we are here. You're going to be mashing your left click a lot. So I'd really recommend either having a macro or just using the mouse wheel for my melee hits. So I'm using my mouse scroll. It is much easier on your fingers. Final tip, I would say, where you point your reticle does matter. So if I use this, if I just do regular hits, even though you see yellow text, I'm doing critical damage and all, you're not really hitting the weak spot. So what you want to do is, as much as possible, aim up and then do your hits. That way you'll also hit the weak spot and gain even more damage out of your hits. See that? Well, that is all the tips I have for you. I hope you really enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment, like, and share your thoughts on this build and let me know how you feel about this. This build, I've been having a really good time in Apocalypse, and I cannot wait to try every other world and see what bosses I can conquer with this just melee setup. So yeah, hope you enjoy this. I'll see you next time.